Okay, so YouTube now says I'm live again, and hopefully, folks will be able to find this. This is the second recent stream I've done on YouTube. I haven't done them too often in the past, and the last two streams I've done, I've encountered technical problems both times. I'm not sure what's responsible for that. I would imagine it's something that can be uh, figured out and solved over time, but it is a little bit annoying at the moment. I see we've got three people. It looks like three people watching right now. Can y'all confirm? Yes, good. Yay. Okay. Jen says, I'm coming over loud and cleared. Mary says, oh, I can see and hear you now. Good. So, howdy, folks. And sorry for the difficulty. I was mentioning that a couple of recent live streams I've done are I've encountered technical problems both times, and so there's apparently some stuff that still needs to be figured out, but at least we're live for the moment. So I've got some questions that were collected for this live stream that I can start us off with, but I see one question. Winston Von Toast says, "What's the biggest pipe that you have?" And it's actually hanging on a wall over there. I'll actually get up and bring it over so you can see it. Hang on just a second. Okay, so this is the biggest pipe I have. It's a Navajo deer antler pipe that I bought in New Mexico a while back, and I have it hanging on my wall. I also have another one that is uh, German or Swiss or something. It's one of those really long ones with the clay bowl that I also am going to hang on the wall, but it's currently in for repairs. So, item of curiosity to start us out. Now, I see that we're getting some questions coming in. So, let me take a look at what we got. BizCath Peter says, my wife has aphantasia. She finds all prayer involving mental images impossible. Is there a Catholic spirituality that is more helpful for people with aphantasia? So, aphantasia is a neurological style whereby people do not generate, at least in its classic form, they don't generate mental imagery. So, if you tell someone with aphantasia, picture yourself in a field, they can't generate a mental image of that, at least typically in the classic form. And this is only and people with aphantasia tend to assume that when people say things like that, like picture yourself in a field, that they're using some kind of metaphorical language because they don't, since they don't generate internal mental imagery, they assume other people don't too. And then they find out sometimes later in adult life, oh, that's not a metaphor. Um, Unfortunately, aphantasia is only a recently identified neurological style. And so I'm not aware of any specific Catholic spirituality that's been developed for people who have aphantasia. It would certainly be possible to do one. It's certainly possible to say prayers and think about things without using mental imagery. I mean, the Lord's Prayer doesn't require us to use mental imagery. And so it's certainly possible to do that. For the moment, I'm not aware of one that is specifically designed for people with aphantasia, but one could construct one's own. And a starting point for doing that would be just selecting prayers and thinking about exercises, like how would I do this as an aphantasic? And you can both nurture your own spiritual life that way. And if you choose, you could potentially explore publishing that for others. creating a website, publishing a booklet. There are any number of things. Now, if you do publish a booklet, you'll want to get an imprimatur on it from your bishop, but assuming that there's no problems with the content of the spirituality you're proposing, even if it's just collecting together different prayers that other people have written. You could have the Lord's Prayer, the Memorare, just screening it for anything that would involve mental imagery and eliminating that. As long as you're not contradicting anything in the Catholic faith, it shouldn't be hard to get an imprimatur. So, BizCath Peter, if your wife is dealing with this condition, I think there are things that she can do, and she could even do things that would help other people with aphantasia. Tony L says, was apostolic tradition written down in the first and second centuries within the writings of the apostolic fathers and their successors like Irenaeus? Shouldn't we emphasize these written traditions? Well, apostolic tradition, much of it was written down in the first and second centuries in the apostolic fathers and their successors like Irenaeus. And Catholic apologists tend to do that. They do tend to emphasize these written traditions. I frequently recommend books of writings of the early church fathers. One of them, the Penguin edition called Early Christian Writings, played a role in my own conversion, and I often recommend that to others. Also, my own book, The Fathers Know Best, tracks the development of written apostolic tradition on different subjects. One thing to be aware of with tradition is it is not simply a collection of data. It's also interactive, so it grows over time. In church documents, it'll thus be referred to as live-in tradition because, for example, all of the different forms of the liturgy that have been developed in the last 2,000 years are expressions of apostolic tradition. Now, that doesn't mean everything in them comes from the apostles. Of course, it doesn't mean that. And so there's a distinction between data that does go back to the apostles and ways in which that data is embedded in larger structures like the liturgy. Also, there can be implications of things that do go back to the apostles that were not realized until later. Like, for example, a classic example that I use of this is Jesus is both fully God and fully man. And the fact that he's God is taught in the New Testament, and the fact that he's man is taught in the New Testament. And one of the implications of that we have no record of people in the apostolic age ever thinking about is he therefore must have two wills. He must have a divine will and he must have a human will. And so in Greek, two is duo, and will is thelema. And so this position that Christ has two wills is known as diotheletism. It's in contrast to another view that appeared at a certain point in church history called monotheletism, which held that Christ had only one will, that his human will was basically subsumed or annihilated in his divine will. But the Orthodox position, which is not something the apostles thought about, but can be derived from what the apostles did teach as an implication, is diotheletism, that Christ has two wills. Also, for that matter, the modern formulation of the Trinity that we use is based on data that goes back to the apostles, but it's a later way that tradition has expressed it based on inferences from things that the apostles taught. So we shouldn't think of apostolic tradition as just the data that goes back to the apostles, but also implications that that data contains that the apostles may not have even thought about. And it also, in a kind of lowercase t tradition, it also can be embedded in other structures such as the liturgy or traditional ways of articulating the faith, even though it's not new, fresh data. So that's a brief look at that, but apostolic tradition, much of it was written down in the first and second centuries, and apologists do point to that. Papuchios Papuchioe, I apologize if I'm saying that wrong. I know who you are. I see your icon and your name frequently. I just have never had much occasion to pronounce the name, so I apologize if I get it wrong. Says, what is the purpose of biblical typology? Does the typology shed light on the truths of the faith for us, or do we merely think more about them and imagine them differently by means of it? Well, the concept of typology is found in the New Testament itself. So there are passages, in fact, the term type, tupos in Greek, is used in the New Testament. And so the concept of typology has a biblical ground in. And the way I would articulate it is there's a distinction between the literal sense of scripture, which is what the human author was aware of and intended to communicate in what he wrote. And then there's the spiritual sense, which is what the divine author or God was aware of and wanted to build in to the text that the human author was writing so that it could be discovered by folks later. And an example of this would be from the book of Hosea, where the prophet Hosea is writing, and he says, on behalf of God, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, it's clear in context in Hosea, in the literal sense of the text, that the child in question is the nation of Israel, and that this is a reference to the Exodus experience. But there's also, and so that's the literal sense of the text. That's what the human author, the prophet Hosea, was intended to communicate. And it's what he was aware of his text meaning. But because there's the divine author behind the human author, and the divine author knows more than the human author knows, since the divine author is omniscient, the divine author can build in additional meanings that the human author is not aware of, and later people in later times can discern those meanings. And so when Matthew goes to write his gospel, he notices, hey, well, Jesus is the Son of God, and God loves him. He says, "This is my beloved son." And he called him out of Egypt too, because after Herod the Great died, Joseph got a message from an angel to that Herod's dead. The people who were trying to kill the child are dead. So now, or not trying to kill him anymore. And so you can come back to the land of Israel. And so Matthew discerned in the statement from the book of Hosea, out of Egypt I called my son, the fact that there's a Christological application here. So this isn't just a statement by Hosea about the Exodus experience, it also foreshadows the return of Jesus from Egypt. And so there's a sense in which it's fulfilled in his life too. And so that's the way that I would imagine typology. And there are some technical distinctions that people may want to make between types and metaphors and so forth. But I think that that basic articulation of the literal sense that the human author intends and the spiritual sense that contains more than what the human author intended is the basis of the theory of typology, where something typically in the Old Testament points forwards. That's the type. Um, eh, and we tend to use the word type a little differently in English, but in biblical and theological discussions, a type is something in the Old Testament typically that foreshadows some New Testament reality, which is what's known as the antitype. It corresponds to the earlier type. So I think that's the theory on which typology works. But I think there's also a concern, which is that modern people, once they become aware of the concept of typology, sometimes go type crazy, and they start seeing everything as a type of everything and interpreting every little detail as having some kind of typological significance. And when that happens, I think Papuchioe, if I'm saying that right, if I'm not saying it right, forgive me. I think they aren't I think that they're straying into territory where they are merely thinking about truths of the faith and imagine them in different ways by means of what they're thinking of as typology, even though we can have much less confidence that God actually intended them to get this particular meaning out of a particular text. So I think that sometimes people just kind of press typology too far and try to do too much with it. Alvananto says if two siblings are trapped in an insulated chamber with limited oxygen, where both will die in 6 hours. By the way, I hope this is not a practical scenario. Where both will die in 6 hours, but one could survive for 12 hours if the other dies, and they know that rescue will arrive in 10 hours. Would it be morally permissible for one sibling to kill himself as a sacrifice so that the other can live? Well, the way that classical moral theology would answer this is that one can never directly kill an innocent person, and that includes killing yourself. So, assuming both of these twins or siblings are innocent, neither's an aggressor who's trying to kill the other, then neither could kill themselves. And on that scenario, given the way this has been constructed, they would both end up dying. And that would be viewed in classical moral theology as a necessary consequence, even though it's not an unavoidable consequence. It would be viewed as a morally necessary consequence of of an of an un, of a problematic situation. And so, because at a minimum, even if the two siblings got into this situation through no fault of their own, um, it's an unfortunate situation, obviously. But since you can never kill an innocent person, and that rules out suicide, innocent in the terms of a non-aggressor, then it would be a morally necessary consequence of an unfortunate situation. So that's what classical moral theology would say. If I were in this situation, I would look at, are there things I could do other than directly kill myself to enable my sibling to survive? So, like, could I decrease my breathing rate sufficiently that even if it might endanger my life, I'm not directly killing myself? And could that generate enough oxygen for my sibling to survive? I would wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, in part because I'm not a medical doctor, but I would wonder, could I be knocked unconscious, or could I meditate to bring down my vital signs so that I'm not consuming as much oxygen? And so I would explore possibilities like that. But then all you have to do is alter the terms of the thought experiment and say, sorry, that won't work. You won't be able to generate enough extra time that way. So you can just refocus the thought experiment on, yeah, maybe you could do all those things and it still wouldn't give you enough time. So get to the real question: can you kill yourself? And the answer, according to classical moral theology, is no, you cannot kill yourself. Jason Reed says, Jimmy, you were the GOAT. Oh, thank you so much. Just wanted to acknowledge your contributions not only to the Catholic message, but to general paranormal rationality and research. Well, thank you. It's something I'm honored to be and fortunate to be able to do. Papu Chiowi also asks, what do you think about the claim that the three kinds of animals for sacrifice in Leviticus 1 represent the three persons of the Holy Trinity? I.e., of the herd representing the Father, and he references the golden calf, of the flocks representing the Son or the Lamb, and of the fowls representing the Holy Spirit. Well, I think it's an interesting proposal. It's one I haven't seriously contemplated, though. There definitely are, at least to our minds, those three categories there. What I would have to do in order to consider this more fully is go back and look at Leviticus 1 and see how clearly distinguished these categories are. I have to think about it in terms of Hebrew thought and how did they classify things, because they may not have had a distinction between I mean, like in English, we typically have a sharp distinction between cows, sheep, and goats. We think of them as three different animals. Um, but in ancient Hebrew thought, they, even though they knew there's a difference between a sheep and a goat, they tended to lump them together. And since all three of these types of animals are kept in groups for agricultural purposes, I would have to say, is there a clear distinction in Hebrew thought between oxen or cows on the one hand, bovine animals, and sheep and goats on the other hand? Do those form two groups in Hebrew thought, or do they form three groups, or do they form one group? They're all just herd animals. Or so I'd have to think about it in those terms, but I haven't done the research on that, so I can't give you a firm opinion, but that's my initial thought. Aaron Carter says, "Who is your favorite Doctor Who character and why?" Well, you could be asking about the doctors, and in that case, I would say my favorite Doctor Who character is the second Doctor Who, the one played by Patrick Troughton. I also like a number of the other doctors quite a bit, but if I had to pick a doctor, I would say the second doctor. He's very humble. He is childlike. He can get a little bit petulant, just like a child can, but he's fundamentally humble and kind and has a sense of humor. He's got great comedic chemistry with his companion Jamie McCrimmon and also later Zoe Harriet, and I think that is a world class combination of characters. The second Doctor, Jamie McCrimmon, and Zoe Harriet, they are an ideal Doctor Who team. But the second Doctor is like Columbo. He's very, very smart and is using his intelligence even when other people don't realize it. So even though he's very humble, just like Columbo, and very friendly, just like Columbo, he's very smart and he allows people to underestimate him on purpose, which means he's willing to take a reputation hit in that people look down on him and dismiss him, when really he's calculating in the background, how am I going to bring good out of this situation? And so he's a lot like Columbo, and I like Columbo a lot too. Second to the second Doctor of the classic Doctors, I would say I probably like the seventh Doctor the most, because I mean, I also like the fourth and the fifth Doctor, but the seventh Doctor is a lot like the second. He's very smart, very calculating. He's not quite as kind as the second Doctor. He's not quite as humble. He's similar, but he's not quite the same. He's more calculating. And so I like him a lot, but not quite as much. Of the newer Doctors, I would say the 11th Doctor is my favorite. Matt Smith patterned his performance significantly on Patrick Troughton's. Patrick Troughton also is the reason we still have the show. The original Doctor was William Hartnell, and when they had to recast him, if Patrick Troughton had not had not done as good a job as he did, the show would have died, and no one would remember it today. So really, Patrick Troughton is central. He's pivotal to Doctor Who history. And to my mind, he's my favorite Doctor. Matt Smith's Doctor is a lot of fun. He is similar to the second Doctor, but he gets written more arrogantly. And I don't like the scenes where he's being arrogant and boasting and stuff like that. I prefer the humble presentation that the second Doctor gave us. If you exclude the doctors from consideration, then I would probably say that my favorite Doctor Who character is Missy. I'm sorry, not Missy. Of the Masters, Missy would be my favorite, but my favorite Doctor Who character would be River Song. There's just a ton of fun that character has, and and she's a delight whenever I see her on screen. Let's see. Now my chat has jumped a bit, so I'm going to back up and see if I can find where I had been. I'm also going to take a drink just so I stay hydrated. I meter how much I drink when I'm doing public appearances that involve me talking. I try to, whether it's calling a dance or whether it's giving a talk or doing a live stream, I try to drink about 12 ounces of fluid every hour so that I stay hydrated. So hang on a sec. Excuse me. Oh, it jumped quite a bit here. Okay, here's where I was. Derek says in 1 Samuel 28, the story of the witch of Endor, would you say that it was Samuel or a demon? It's very unambiguously Samuel. And we know that in several ways. One of them is the author of Second Samuel says it's Samuel. He never mentions a demon. He identifies the ghost that is brought back up as Samuel. He says, "Then Samuel said." So you're reading into the text if you say, "Oh, this is not Samuel. This is a demon." That idea is nowhere presented in the text. That is total eisegesis, or reading into the text what your preferred theory is rather than letting the text speak for itself. Also, the author uses a factive verb. A factive verb is one that indicates that something is true. So if I said, Psychelit believes it is raining outside, I didn't use a factive verb. I said he believes it. I didn't say it was true that it's raining outside. So I used a non factive verb that doesn't tell you what I'm asserting. I could agree with Cy and also believe it's raining outside, or I could disagree with Cy and believe it's not raining outside. But on the other hand, if I said Psychelit knows that it is raining outside, then I've used a factive verb, a verb that indicates it is a fact in the speaker's opinion that it is raining outside. If Psychelit just believes it's raining outside, it may or may not be. But if I say Psychelit knows it's raining outside, then I'm telling you it is raining outside. Well, in the course of 1 Samuel 28, uh, the medium sees a spirit arising from the ground, and Saul asks, "What does he look like?" And she describes the spirit. And then the author of First Samuel, the divinely inspired author, tells us, then Saul knew it was Samuel. So the author of First Samuel is using a factive verb, know, and he's telling us this is Samuel. So the idea this is a demon is just total eisegesis. It's reading an alternative interpretation into the text rather than letting the text speak for itself. We also have another way of knowing that it's Samuel, and that's because we have the book of Sirach, which is considered canonical in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. And the book of Sirach contains passages praising various Old Testament figures, and one of them is Samuel. And when Sirach discusses Samuel, one of the ways he illustrates Samuel's greatness as a prophet is by saying he prophesied even after his own death and gave King Saul this message. So the divinely inspired author of Sirach confirms for us that this really was Samuel. He was prophesying after his death. So this kind of experience, even though the Israelites were forbidden to seek it, is one that God can sometimes allow to happen. Tony L says, are there are certain obligatory good works that are ordinarily required to remain in a state of justification, grace, or salvation. Is Jesus given examples of mortal sins of omission in Matthew 25, verses 41 to 46? So Matthew 25, 41 to 46, that's the parable of the sheep and the goats. And so that's where Jesus is saying, as you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it to me, or as you didn't do it to the least of my brethren, you didn't do it to me. And he's talking about things like, visiting prisoners, visiting the sick, things like that. So if we're able to reasonably do good that's going to benefit another person, then we need to act on that. And if we deliberately refuse to do so, there are situations in which it would cost us the state of grace, where we would no longer be loving God and loving neighbor if we refused to do certain things. Like, it, if I know for a fact someone's going to, is starving, and I can help them and they don't have any other source of help, well, then all things being equal, I need to help them. Now, that's not the same thing as driving down the highway and seeing someone panhandling, because actually a lot of those panhandlers are not starving. And, they may be holding a sign that says, have no food, anything will help, God bless. But actually, a lot of them are tricksters that are exaggerating their situation. I've even seen people do more dramatic forms of panhandling trickery. Once I was in Nazareth, the one over in Israel, and I was climbing up the hill to the Church of the Annunciation, and there was a panhandler sitting there on the street who was pretending to be injured and unable to walk. And as the tourists were coming up, he was pulling up his pant leg to demonstrate a bloody wound, which was clearly makeup. So, unfortunately, there are people um, who are trying to depend on charity from others who are actually tricking people. So I don't want people to get scrupulous about, you've got to give money to every panhandler you see. In fact, one of my rules is I never give money, because money is fungible. And frequently what panhandlers will do is they'll just go buy alcohol with it. And so I will provide other forms of assistance, but not something that's as fungible as money that you can just do anything you want with. It's a complex situation, but I would say there are situations in which refusing to help someone could exclude the love of God and neighbor from your heart in such a way that you lose the state of grace. On the other hand, I don't think, because Tony L asks, are they ordinarily required? I don't think that we're ordinarily in such situations. I think in order for something to actually cost you the state of grace, it's not an ordinary situation. There has to be more to it. And the situation has to be very precisely structured in order for it to actually cost you the state of grace. Because what you're doing in order to cost yourself the state of grace, you're having to say, yeah, I don't care about God that much. I'd rather have this created thing than God. And most people aren't ordinarily doing that in this kind of situation. There are sins of omission that could cost you the state of grace, but I don't think they're ordinary. Let's see. Jonathan De La Rosa says, "What do modern days Jewish people say about the kingdom of David? Do they still have Do they still have trace a lineage back to David with people alive today?" No, As far as I know, there are no well-established um, lines of descent in the Jewish community that can be traced back to David. There are some lines of descent that are traced plausible, at least this is the belief, that can be traced to specific tribes or even families within tribes. If someone's last name is Levy, for example, or Levitt, or things like that, it's regarded as a sign that they're a descendant of the tribe of Levi. And more specifically than that, if their last name is Cohen, then it's regarded as a sign that they are descended from the family of Aaron, that they are that they're a priest, or Kohen in Hebrew. And so if you see someone with a specialized name like Levi or Levitt, or Cohen, they may have a special lineage, and they typically have certain roles in synagogue ritual that they're allowed to do as a result of that lineage. But I'm not aware of anyone having a lineage that they can trace back to David himself. The Elder Tree Grove says, considering the myriad of evidence related to Bigfoot, but also considering the lack of a voucher specimen, what is what is, in your opinion, the most reasonable position to take on this matter? I would say open-mindedness. I acknowledge there are reasons to be skeptical of the idea of an undiscovered large North American primate, but I also recognize that there's more evidence for Bigfoot than you might think. What we don't have is what the Elder Tree Grove notes as a voucher specimen, also sometimes called a type specimen, which is a specimen that can be scientifically studied. Typically, it's a corpse. It doesn't have to be, it could also be alive, but we don't have that for Bigfoot. And so that's why Bigfoot is considered undiscovered by mainstream science, though studied by cryptozoology. Um, I would say that, open-minded skepticism towards Bigfoot is the position that I prefer. It's the position that I myself take. I'm not at all convinced that Bigfoot exists, or other Bigfoot-like creatures, but I'm open, I don't dismiss evidence that genuinely is unusual and that could point to a North American primate. I'm going to be talking about this more on Mysterious World. Early on, this is like 7 years ago when we first started the podcast. In episode 3, we looked at Bigfoot, and at the time I said, I would love for Bigfoot to be real, but I said I don't think the evidence points in that direction. And I really regret one particular thing. I had encountered some problematic data about people who had claimed to be involved in hoaxing the Patterson Gimlin film, which is the famous 1967 film where you see Bigfoot walking across a creek bed and turns and looks at the camera, and that's the basis for a lot of the silhouettes that you see of Bigfoot today. And there were individuals, there was a costume maker who claimed to be involved in that, and there was also a gentleman named Bob Hieronymus who claimed to have been in the suit. But it later turned out those claims, both on the part of the costume maker and on the part of Bob Hieronymus, were problematic. And I didn't know enough at the time to spot that. And so I've regretted passing on that information without the context indicating that these claims have been made, but they are problematic. And there's actually more to be said about the Patterson Gimlin film in its favor than I was aware of at the time. And so I planned on revisiting the topic of Bigfoot on Mysterious World and taking a closer look at it over a number of different episodes. One thing I would recommend to people who don't want to wait for that is a book called Sasquatch by a gentleman named Jeff Meldrum, who is um, he's I'm it's on the tip of my tongue, but I better not say it because I don't want to say it wrong. But he is a actually qualified scientist to know about, for example, primate musculature and things like that. And he believes that Bigfoot is real. And if you read his book, he's got a lot of evidence that's quite significant. Um, Coming up on Mysterious World in April, I am kind of beginning this new occasional look at Bigfoot and Bigfoot-like creatures with an episode based here in Arkansas on the Fouke monster. Now I'm in Northwest Arkansas in Fayetteville, but if you take Highway 71 straight down from Fayetteville down the western side of Arkansas to southwestern Arkansas, and just stay on Highway 71, you're gonna hit a town called Fouke. And in and around Fouke, there have been reports of a Bigfoot-like creature that has come to be known as the Fouke monster. It's also featured in the Boggy Creek movies, the only one of which that's worth watching for anything other than comedy purposes is The Legend of Boggy Creek. That's the first of the Boggy Creek movies, and it's done as a kind of docudrama. The others are totally fiction. But I'm going to be looking at the Falk monster in this episode. We've already recorded it. It's in post production right now, and it'll be coming out towards the beginning of April. Imjewel says, "What would you recommend for someone who considers the supernatural to be farcical, and that there is always a natural explanation, even if we're not aware yet? This is my huge hurdle with religion." Well, um, one thing, I mean, okay, so let's think about this position. Um, Imjewel says that they have a problem with the supernatural, and there's always a natural explanation, even if we're not aware of it yet. Well, okay, that's a philosophical assumption. Now, per the philosophical principle known as the principle of sufficient reason, we can always assume that if something happens, then there is some sufficient reason for it. There's an explanation for it. So that's a point of common ground. Both the naturalist and the supernaturalist can agree if something happens, then there's a reason for it. Things just don't happen randomly with no cause. There's a cause and effect relationship that we see. So what we're talking about here is not, is there an explanation, but what kind of an explanation is there? And the naturalist is assuming that the universe operates according to a single set of laws that apply in all cases. And that's a possibility. God could, or even if there wasn't a God, one way or another, the universe could operate under a single set of laws. But what the supernaturalist claims is that in addition to the laws we see operating in the physical universe around us that we can detect with our senses and with technological extensions of our senses like telescopes and microscopes and things like that, we see one set of laws operating in the physical world around us, but we also see evidence of another set of laws operating that occasionally affect things in the physical universe. So essentially, the claim that the supernaturalist is making is that there's at least two sets of laws that operate in reality. Now, if you just define nature as well, it's all of reality. Then of course all law is going to be natural law, but then you haven't really changed the question, because there still could be two different laws operating in largely different realms. If you call both of those realms nature, well, you haven't changed the fact that there could be one set of laws operated in this part of nature and another set of laws operated in this part of nature. So that's just a terminological trick, if I can put it that way. It doesn't really address the issue of, do we see one or more than one set of laws operating in the world? And even then you can have sort of boundary questions about, well, how do we distinguish one set of laws from another? But I think recognizing that the assumption that there is always a natural explanation, meaning a non-supernatural one, is an assumption, I think can help open one's mind to, well, then what would the alternative look like? And how could I identify the alternative? How could I find evidence for the naturalist rather than having it just be an assumption? How could I find evidence for it? And how could I find evidence against it? Um, and I think that there are some possibilities there. One of them is by looking at evidence regarding scientific miracles that have been documented scientifically, like various miraculous healings in the cases of saint canonizations, where they've brought in medical experts who, some of whom are atheists, and they say, yeah, there is no explanation for for this event that happened. We have no way of explaining this scientifically. It's not just a remission. It's not just, this disease is not known to go into remission. This is just, or this guy's leg got reattached after it had been amputated. There are medically documented miracles that need to be taken seriously, and that would indicate that there's something out there besides the normal laws that we see operating in medicine. Also, one can look at the paranormal, at the evidence of parapsychology, because there are a lot of there is a lot of documentation in favor of parapsychological phenomena, including psychic functioning and including various death-related experiences, like near-death experiences and deathbed visions. I've done a considerable amount on Mysterious World about survival-related issues, and we've got good evidence for survival, and I'm going to be doing more. In particular, I'm going to be looking at death. At near-death experiences that contain veridical information. That is information that was not known to the person at the time they had the experience, and that goes beyond random chance, and that turned out to be true. So I've got a whole book devoted to. It's got over 100 cases of veridical near-death experiences that have independent medical witnesses, and I'm going to be drawing on that in this upcoming episode on that. But I would say, Imjul, thinking about one's assumptions and how one could then find evidence for or against the assumptions, and then going and looking for evidence against the assumptions to cross-check them and see, do they hold up, by looking at medical miracles that have been documented and by looking at paranormal studies that have been done, both of psychic functioning and of survival-related experiences, like some I've covered on Mysterious World. I think those would be plausible avenues to pursue. Colin Rupke says, as Catholics, can we use theories of evil where evil exists substantially unlike a privation, where evil exists substantially unlike in privation theories of evil? Well, it depends on what you mean by substantially unlike privation theories of evil. A privation theory of evil, for those who may not be familiar, is one that says evil is not a positive reality in and of itself. It's not like a substance that exists. Instead, it's a deprivation of uh, of of something. It's something that is lacking, that needs to be present. And since the Catholic Church is not committed to specific philosophical schools, it is not committed, even though the idea of evil as a privation is a very important theory that you find in philosophy and theology, for example, in Thomistic philosophy and theology, which is the school of thought based on St. Thomas Aquinas's views. You do find privation theories prominently, But as far as I'm aware, the church has never taught that evil must be conceived of as a privation. And so, as far as I'm aware, the church is open in principle to other theories of evil besides that. What the church would not be open to is anything that proposes that evil is a self-existent principle, as if it existed independently of God. And the church would reject any theory of evil that would make God the author of sin, moral evil. So there has to be free will involved that is not God himself. Um, because all of his decisions are morally perfect, and so he doesn't do anything evil. He may create free will and give it to creatures who then misuse it, but he himself is not directly causing them to sin. And thirdly, anything that says evil is eternal, and that would also be rejected. So, off the top of my head, those would be three boundary conditions that the church would definitely insist on, that everything that exists is created by God, so evil is not independent of God. That since everything is created by God, everything has a finite history, and thus evil is not some kind of eternal principle with God. And thirdly, that God does not cause the specific form of evil known as moral evil or sin. But beyond that, I would think there's considerable liberty of opinion regarding exactly how you understand evil. Personally, I think the privation theory of evil, where something's missing that needs to be present, is a logical, and I think favorable to my mind, theory of evil. So I tend to support that. But strictly speaking, I would say that as far as I'm aware, I think that the church allows openness on this question, and therefore you could articulate what evil is in other ways besides dependent exclusively on the concept of privation. Joseph Pereira says, I recall you said the Legion of Superheroes was one of your favorite comic series. Who is your favorite Legionnaire? Thanks and long live the Legion. Okay, so yeah, the Legion of Superheroes is my favorite all time comic book superhero team. For those who may not be aware, they're a group of young heroes in the 31st century. So you get superheroes and science fiction. What's better than that? They I have not liked all um, Legion series, though. For example, recently I was excited the Legion had not had a regular ongoing series for several years, because comic book series go have ups and downs in their popularity, and they're not always in print. And the Legion had been out of print for several years, and then it was announced that Brian Michael Bendis would be writing a new Legion series, and I was like, "Oh yes, great. I more more new Legion stories." And then I read his series and I hated it. He just had logorrhea out the wazoo. He just in just dialogue balloon after dialogue balloon after dialogue balloon. It was just way too word dense. And worse than that, he was trying to incorporate a ton of 31st century slang into it. That it was just hard to read, and it was super slow moving, and I just didn't like it at all. So I don't like everything Legion, but they are my all-time favorite group. And I would like them. I mean, I like the Justice League, I like the Justice Society, I like the X-Men, or at least the first and second generation X-Men. I understand they've done loads of other stuff since then that I have no idea about. Um, but yeah, the Legion's my favorite. In terms of who is my favorite Legionnaire, well, I tend not to think in terms of favorites that much. So I don't really have a favorite Legionnaire at the moment. Some Legionnaires, and I've I have liked at different times. The individual Legionnaires can go up and down in how much I like what the writers and artists are doing with them. Um, I tend
So the original 3 Legionnaires were Cosmic Boy, Lightning Lad, and Saturn Girl. And I like all 3 of them. Especially I like Cosmic Boy and Saturn Girl. Also, one character who became a Legionnaire early on was Brainiac 5, and who is super intelligent and looks cool. I mean, he's got blonde hair, which I had as a kid, and green skin. And I always, especially as a kid, I always kind of identified with Brainiac 5. So he's one that I've liked. I also like Timberwolf. Timberwolf is sort of the original Wolverine. He existed before Wolverine did, and Wolverine is kind of based on Timberwolf, even though Wolverine is by Marvel and Timberwolf is by DC. Particularly in the 1970s, there was an artist named Mike Grell who redesigned the visual look of all the Legionnaires. Some of his redesigns were not that great. Like he had Saturn Girl wearing basically a bikini, a 2-piece bikini. And that I didn't think that I think that's kind of hilarious now. But I don't think that's the best look for her. Also, he had Cosmic Boy in this bizarre looking one-piece thing that I am not a fan of either. It looks ridiculous. But he did have a nice design for Timberwolf, where he had blunked out eyes with big kind of fearsome eyelashes, and he had kind of spiked hair, and he looked interesting. He looked cool. And so I like Timberwolf. I also like a character that wasn't with the team for too long, but she was a lot of fun. Her name was Monstress, and she was basically a DC version of She-Hulk. She didn't look like She-Hulk. She looked like the Hulk, only as a woman. And initially she had green skin, but I guess Marvel sent a letter of complaint, and so they changed her to have an orange skin. What I really liked about Monstress was she was so feminine. Even though she's this huge hulking brute, she still appreciates the feminine things in life. And I thought that was just a delightful combination of, of Beauty and the Beast. Another one that I liked who was barely with the team for any length of time at all was CC Beck. What did they call her? She was in the Shazam family. She was also from the future. And she was named after the artist who was made famous by doing work on Captain Marvel, Shazam, whose initials were C.C. Beck. And so they just shoved the 2 initials together to make the woman's name Cece. And so CC Beck, I think they may have called her Thunder, but she was basically a Shazam-based hero, and she would become, since Shazam himself was no longer the guardian of the Rock of Eternity, but now Captain Marvel was in her time, she would say Captain Marvel and become Thunder, I guess. But she was a lot of fun too. Unfortunately, she was barely with the team. They didn't explore her character very much. And long live the Legion. Dorian Walker 71 says, what advice / prayers / books would you recommend for someone struggling with full trust in God, specifically related to infertility within a Catholic marriage, although nothing appears to be medically wrong? Well, this is a question I really haven't researched. So infertility is a subcase of the problem of evil. And so the same basic solutions are going to apply to it as apply to other cases of the problem of evil. One wants to do the best one can in the situation. One wants to, to overcome the infertility if possible. So you want to explore all the different avenues that medical science would make available, that you can reasonably afford, and that don't have horrendous side effects, and that are morally illicit. And there's a bunch of those. There are doctors who specialize in Catholic family planning and helping people have children when they're having difficulties, which I gather is, unfortunately becoming more difficult than it was in the old days. I'm not sure about the statistics on that, but that's at least what I've heard anecdotally. Then, to the extent that the problem cannot be cured or cured anytime soon, I guess I would say, I mean, it's like any other form of suffering that a person has. And so reading stuff about the problem of evil, or like I did a talk on the problem of evil a while back that is on my YouTube channel. It's called If God Exists, Why Do I Suffer? And in that, I open up in a way I don't typically about some of my own suffering. And a lot of people have said that they found that video very helpful. So I would suggest watching that. There are other books about the problem of evil that, of a practical nature as opposed to just a philosophical nature that could be helpful. I'd probably go on Amazon and say and type in something like, where is God when I hurt, or stuff like that. Um, Also, something that occurs to me is there are quite a number of uh, couples in the Bible that deal with infertility. And it starts early. It starts in Genesis. It goes through to the Gospels with Zechariah and Elizabeth in the Gospel of Luke. In these cases, the ones that are mentioned in the Bible, the people ended up having children, sometimes very late in life, um, but they were able eventually to have children. And, that can be a sign of hope. On the other hand, even if one is not ultimately able to have children, there are these biblical figures that knew the pain of infertility for large periods of their lives. And of course, there were others that, you know, just were infertile, but they tend not to be major biblical figures since we're following family lines through the Bibles. But I would meditate on on these different individuals. They include Abraham and Sarah. They include Jacob and his wife Rachel. They include Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel. They include Zechariah and Elizabeth, and there are others. And so I would look to their stories and meditate on them and see if there are any insights into what they experienced that could play a role or be comforting um, to us today if we're dealing with this problem. Like I remember, at one point Rachel turns to Jacob and she's so frustrated about not having any children when her sister Leah is having all kinds. She's just popping them out, and and Rachel can't even have one, and she's like talking to Jacob is like, "Give me children, or I'm gonna die." And he's like, "Am I in the position of the Lord who has closed your womb? I'm trying, but you know, and just the humanness of that situation. I feel for both Rachel and for Jacob there. Um, and so look into their situations and also pray into them, because they did go through this. And so you can think of all of those biblical figures as patron saints of infertility. And you can turn to them and ask them for their intercession as you're pursuing various, medical options for how to encourage fertility. And so those are some of my thoughts on that subject. Mike Less says, Angel of the Lord, Old Testament, angel or pre incarnate Christ? If angel, should we assume it's created? Justin Martyr is naming this angel as pre incarnate Christ. Any thoughts? Well, yeah. By the way, um, since you ask about this, Michael, I'll mention that this has come up relatedly. There's a Catholic named Sam Shamoon who is rather sharp elbowed. And he found an article I wrote back in 2006 in which I discussed the angel of the Lord, and I said there's more than one opinion on this, and you'll find more than one opinion, including in the church fathers. And I said at the time that I preferred thinking of this as an angel who is usually not the pre-incarnate Christ, but I expressed openness. Well, Sam Shamoon, being Sam Shamoon, called me out and started doing videos about this. And I'm like, dude, I did this article what? Oh, almost 20 years ago. And you didn't even think maybe I've altered my views in some sense in the last 19 years. It's not worth finding out whether that might be the case before you start ragging on someone in public. Well, he also, I was watching, I haven't watched his videos in full, but I was watching a part of one where he was taking exception to an opinion I expressed. I'm not even sure about what, but it involved the Apostle Paul. And he was saying to his audience, "Do you see why I get angry? He's just butchered Paul." And I'm going, dude, someone expressing a difference of opinion about how to interpret a verse in Paul, you need help. I mean, go get some counseling or take an anger management class if that's the kind of thing that's really getting you enraged in public. I mean, that's just disproportionate to the situation. But like I said, I haven't watched his videos in full yet. Don't know that I'm gonna. Um, and uh, and I don't know that I'm gonna respond, although I may. I've thought about maybe doing an episode of the Jimmy Akin podcast on this subject, or I could even do it on Mysterious World, but I don't know that I'm going to respond to him because, frankly, he's acting like a troll. And one of the standard pieces of advice is don't feed the troll. Um, Now, I might make an exception to that, but that's where we are at the moment. In any event, had Sam Shamoon decided to ask me, has your thought evolved in the last 20 years on this subject? I would say, yeah, it has. I am more open to the idea that the angel of the Lord may sometimes represent the incarnate Christ or otherwise represent a divinity, um, even without specifying the pre-incarnate Christ in particular. Although I'm quite open to the pre-incarnate Christ as well, but I would say we need to approach these texts with some caution because there are other ways of taking them. And clearly, in some instances where you have the phrase, the angel of the Lord, it is not, or angel of the Lord, it is not referring to the pre incarnate Christ. There are times where it refers to other angels that are clearly not Christ. That's easily documentable in the New Testament, for example. So I'm open on this. I'm not prepared to commit to a single position, but I'm quite open to the idea of the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament as the manifestation of divinity, including the pre-incarnate Christ. And if Sam Shamoon would check with people instead of just taking stuff they wrote 20 years ago and assuming there are no updates, he would know that. Let's see. Karen Lynn, 1956, says if a teenager does not want to attend mass but goes to mass, he does not he does not want to be there. Should he be receiving Holy Communion? Would he be committing mortal sin by receiving? Well, um, if he just doesn't want to go to mass, well, a lot of people can go to mass who would rather be doing something else. Um, the mere fact that he doesn't want to be there, but he's there doesn't constitute a mortal sin. So unless he's in a state of mortal sin, he can go ahead and receive communion like any other Catholic. If he is in a state of mortal sin, well, then he shouldn't be receiving. But merely not wanting to be here and preferring to do something else, that that that's not mortal sin in and of itself. Now I can imagine how an individual who's going out of a sense of family obligation because their parents are requiring them to. I can imagine how a person like that could be in a state of mortal sin, but merely having a desire not to be here, that's not going to be enough. You're going to need something else. And we shouldn't be too quick to judge. Um, because teenagers are teenagers and they're going through all kinds of crazy hormone changes, and their catechesis may not be perfect, and their minds are young, and given their hormones going crazy, they may not be thinking straight, so they may not be responsible fully for what's going on. And so I wouldn't be too, if someone says I don't want to be here. Okay, I understand that, but I'm not gonna assume, especially given the craziness of teenage years and the limitations that people deal with in teenage years, I'm not gonna assume they're fully responsible for that. And even if I was, um, convinced that they shouldn't be receiving communion, in the objective, I would at least ask a question of, if I tell them to stop taking communion, will it push them further away from the church? It is, as a parent, I would have some responsibility for trying to guide them. I do have responsibility for trying to guide them, correctly. But as successful parents know, there are times where you let kids make their own mistakes, especially as they're getting older. Your job is not to, as a parent, is not to guarantee that your child never makes a mistake. And sometimes, as part of the growth and maturation process, you need to let them make their own mistakes. And Jesus subjected himself to the possibility of people receiving him in communion when they shouldn't. That's a choice he made. He didn't have to do that. He could, if he wanted, he could vanish from the host before it goes into the mouth of a sinner, but he chooses not to do that. So Jesus himself has chosen to put himself in a situation where people may receive him when they shouldn't. In fact, priests at times are obliged to let people receive him, even when they know from private situations, like what they've learned in confession. They may know this person isn't really repentant of this mortal sin they're committing. They shouldn't be receiving, but they are not allowed to deny the person communion because it's not manifest grave sin. It is not publicly known. It's something the priest knows about, but it is not manifest to the community. And so the priest is required by law to give communion to this person that they know is in mortal sin. Well, in the same way, there can be a situation where if you tell the teenager, you must not receive communion, you must be here, but you must not receive communion, that could drive the child further away from the church and from Christ and from Christianity. And what a parent wants to do is prescind to some degree from what's happening in particular cases and look at the child's long-term good. And so I would say there are several reasons for caution here. Merely not wanting to be here is not a mortal sin. Um, the child is undergoing, it has limitations and challenges based on their age that can mitigate their responsibility for things. And if you crack down too hard, you may actually push the child away from God. And so I would say there are significant reasons for caution here, as well as prayer and dialogue and so forth. But those are some of the things that occur to me. Todd Jambone says, "What is the significance of Jesus using 5 barley loaves and 2 fish to multiply food for the people when he could have made the food appear out of thin air?" Well, I would assume that it's an illustration of, I mean, it is a miracle, but I would say it's an illustration of the way that God can work miracles in using human elements. And this is something we see elsewhere, like when Jesus makes mud and puts it on people's eyes to heal their eyes. This is God working through nature rather than just circumventing nature and saying, bang, there's the food you want. Um, and there's something dramatic about seeing food not just appear, but seeing it multiplied. That's a different kind of thing. And it brings out a different aspect of what God is capable of, and thus a different aspect of his glory. It also, I think there are some lessons that it teaches on the human level that God can enter into our human situation and may provide solutions for us in ways that are extensions of our ordinary human situation. He may not just circumvent them. He may work through the situations. Just like in this case, he didn't just make the needed food appear, he took existing food and multiplied it. And so he entered into this situation to provide the solution in a miraculous way. And God may do the same thing for us in other ways. We may have a need, and rather than giving us a dramatic, overt, bang, here's the solution, God may enter in to what we currently have and work with that to get us where we need to be in a miraculous but different way. Also, one of the things I like that's kind of connected with this is in one of the gospels, it talks about how after the feeding of the 5,000, they picked up 12 baskets worth of bread. And in one of the gospels, it mentions that they did that because Jesus said, pick it all up. And I like that because that shows that even when God does a miracle, we don't want to take that in a kind of for granted fashion. You could say, okay, we fed all these people, and there's still a bunch of bread laying around, but we'll do. God can obviously make bread, so we'll just forget about the bread that He's made here. We'll let it go to waste. And I like the fact Jesus said, no, don't let it go to waste. God made this. Let's pick it up and use it. And so I like that attitude of not just taking future miracles for granted, but when God has given you a miracle or a resource, whether he gave it to you miraculously or not, don't waste it. Use it thriftily. Use the benefits that God has given you. And so I think there's kind of a message on the backside of the miraculous feed-ins as well, and that includes the feeding of the 4,000, where they also collected the a bunch of baskets worth of food afterwards. RoboSquid 25 says, would a shipyard where new warships are being built be an acceptable target in a war? In principle, yes. Shipyards are essential. Ships in war are weapons and troops delivery systems, and so taking out a shipyard where they're building weapons and troop delivery systems, that would in principle be an acceptable target in a war. You'd want to try to do it in a way that minimizes civilian casualties, like maybe bombing the shipyard at night when all the workers are home and only a few people are going to be on site. But in principle, yeah, shipyards would be legitimate military targets in a war. Other says, could precognitive dreams not be a direct view into the future, but the psyche gaining info telepathically and predicting stuff naturally? Basically, telepathically gaining info and deducing it like a weatherman. One isn't peeking into the future or gaining insight not based on observation. So this is an interesting question, and parapsychologists actually think about this kind of thing a lot. There are multiple when someone has an apparent precognitive experience, there are multiple possible explanations. So the three classic forms of ESP are telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Telepathy is getting information from another mind, so it's mind to mind contact. Clairvoyance is getting information from another place, it's mind to place contact. And precognition is getting information from another time, so it's mind to time contact. And in addition to ESP, there's also PK, or psychokinesis, which is mind interacting with physical systems, mind over matter. It's sometimes put that way. Well, when someone has an apparently precognitive dream, let's say it's the night of September 11th, 2001, and let's say I have a dream about terrorists crashing into the World Trade Center. Now, I actually remember this wasn't a dream, but I actually remember what I did the night before 9/11. I was at an electronics store in San Diego, and it was Fry's Electronics. And I was there, I was buying some electronics. I don't remember what, but I was there buying some electronics. And this was a popular enough store at the time that they had this huge line and they direct people to individual tellers. And they had someone at the front of the line who was elevated to see which teller was open, and then they point you towards that one. And so I'm coming up to the front of the line. This is the evening of September 10th. I'm coming up to the front of the line, and the woman is wearing a headscarf, and she's, a little darker complected. So I said, "Hey, where are you from?" And she said, I think she said Yemen. Um, but it was an Arabic speaking country. And so I said, "Salam," just to be friendly, because I knew the word for hello in her language. And I often try to speak a few words of other people's languages to, show interest and honor and respect them and their culture. And so, I just being friendly said salam. And the next day, terrorists plow into the World Trade Center. That was totally not her fault, but I just was struck by the irony of it in my own experience of the situation. Because here I am trying to be friendly to someone from an Arabic speaking country, and not everyone is not everyone reciprocates. In any event, and that's true of all groups, but in any event, that was my experience. Well, let's suppose it's the evening of September 10th into September 11th, and I have a dream about terrorists plowing airplanes into the World Trade Center, which actually a lot of people had that dream. What could it be? Well, it could be precognition, because that event hadn't happened yet. And so I could be getting that information from tomorrow morning and from another time. On the other hand, the dream also could be telepathy, because the Muslim terror teams already know what they're planning on doing tomorrow morning. So I could establish telepathic contact with them. Um, Now, there are other dreams where I could be getting the information clairvoyantly. And I'll give an illustration. It doesn't have to be a dream. I'll give an illustration of that in just a moment. And then, is there any possibility I could have telekinetically or psychokinetically brought this about? Could I be using my own mind over matter or psychokinesis to cause an effect? Well, actually, parapsychologists think a lot about this. Now, in the case I just named, um, given that I'm dreaming this on the night of September 10th into September 11th, it looks like it would most plausibly be either precognition or telepathy. But in other situations, it could be any of the four. Let's suppose that we're doing an ESP test. And so you've got a set of what are called Zener cards, although Carl Zener, who invented the cards, didn't really like them being called by his name. So they're also called ESP cards. But these are those cards that have, the five shapes: the circle, the cross, the three wavy lines, the square, and the star. And so we're doing the test. Let's say I'm the experimenter, so I've got a bunch of Zener cards here that I've randomized, and I look at one. Let's say we're doing a telepathy test. So I pull one up and I look at it, and I see the shape, and I say, "What shape am I looking at?" And you say star, and I turn it around and I say, "You're right, it was a star." Okay, well, maybe you got that the way we're trying to test for. Maybe you pulled that information out of my mind, but maybe you didn't. Maybe when I'm looking at the card, instead of pulling the information out of my mind, you gained the information clairvoyantly. You pulled it off the face of the card. and became aware of it that way. You didn't touch my mind at all. You touched the card with your ESP and figured it out from like the hidden face of the card, which is what telepathy is. It's gaining clairvoyance is. It's gaining information about a distant or hidden location, like the hidden face of a card. Or maybe you didn't get the information from the card. Maybe you got it from the future, because remember, I turned the card around and gave you your feedback and says, yep, it was a star. Maybe you subconsciously looked into the future to when I turned the card around. And so you got the information precognitively. Or maybe when I randomize the cards, when I'm shuffling them, maybe you're psychokinetically reaching and down and affecting how I'm shuffling them, so that it's guaranteed that when I pull a card, it's going to be a star. So all of those are possibilities. And as a result of the difficulty of pulling them apart, parapsychologists often refer to general ESP or GESP when there's no way to clearly distinguish which version of ESP is being used. ESP, you'll recall, is not psychokinesis, but it's telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. Well, there is a way to force one of those onto the table in an ESP experiment. It is possible to force precognition into play. So even though in the case of the dream that the first other is asking about, it could just be telepathy. Um, there are ways to make precognition happen. And the way you do that in an experimental setting is by not selecting the target until after the person has made their guess. So for example, I say we're going to do an ESP test. This is going to be a precognitive ESP test. So I haven't shuffled them yet. I don't know what the card is. They are not yet in a determined order, so you can't just look down the stack of cards. Um, but tell me, what's the first card I'm going to draw? And then tell me the second card I'm going to draw, and the third card, and the fourth card, and so forth. Well, the targets have not yet been chosen. I haven't shuffled them yet. And so I don't know the answer of what those cards are going to be. You can't pull that information from my mind. So this is not telepathy, and they're not yet in the order they're going to be in. So you can't just use clairvoyance to go down the stack and see what they all are. So if we're testing ESP here, then you have to get that information from another time. You have to get it from the future. And so it's possible to force precognition into an ESP test. But there's still that fourth possibility, psychokinesis, which is not part of ESP. There remains the possibility that when I go to shuffle the cards, you subconsciously psychokinetically affect how I'm shuffling them, so that they come out in the order they need to come out to fit your guesses. So we can't always distinguish between, even though we can force, if this is ESP, it's precognition. We can't always force it to be ESP. It could be psychokinesis instead. But these kind of things are the topics that parapsychologists think about and worry about and argue about, and try to design tests that are capable of distinguishing between these different hypotheses. So this is part of the rigor and discipline of doing parapsychology, is thinking through all these options. Mark Soblicki says, will the Carl Tanzler case ever be on the list, though it involves some disturbing stuff? I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the Carl Tanzler case, but Mark, if you want to email feedback at mysterious.fm with that name and any information about the case you're aware of, that could be of benefit to me for research purposes, I'd love to hear about it. You say that it involves some disturbing stuff. That may or may not be a barrier. I do try to keep the podcast clinical and substantially family friendly, so it'd be okay for, older children and stuff. Um, but I found ways to do some true crime stuff that is disturbing, often by simply stating the disturbing stuff in more clinical terms or by omitting some of the disturbing stuff and just indicating it's there, but we're not going to talk about it. I did the Manson murders a long time ago in the first year of the podcast. More recently, I've been doing episodes on the Zodiac Killer, and I've got a two-parter coming up in April on Jack the Ripper. And the Jack the Ripper case, all of these cases, but especially the Jack the Ripper case, definitely involves disturbing stuff. But I found ways to handle it on the show. And so, I might or might not be able to do the Carl Tanzler case. But if you want to send me information I could use to research it, I'd appreciate it. The address for that, once again, is feedback@mysterious.fm, as in FM radio. Daniel C. says, do you think scripture contradicts open theism? Okay, so open theism is a view that is different than classical theism. In classical theism, God is understood to be eternal and outside of time and ontologically simple, so he's not made out of parts. He's understood to be omniscient, so he knows everything, at least everything that can be known. He's omnipotent and can do anything, or at least anything that can be done. And he's omnibenevolent, meaning he's all good. Well, open theists don't buy all of that. They want to say that God is not outside of time, that he's capable of change. They may want to say that he's not omniscient because he limits his knowledge of the future in order to preserve free will. He's like, would be omniscient if he chose, but he chooses not to be. I think that the Israelites went, and this is something, that we have evidence for in scripture itself. They went on a journey with God as they learned more about him. And originally, the Israelite conception of God was not that different than pagan conceptions of their gods. Pagan conceptions of gods are open theistic. Zeus, he's not a supreme, outside of time, eternally perfect, all powerful, that's just not Zeus, and it's not Thor, and it's not Anubis. All of the pagan gods are finite entities. They may be superhuman, but they're still finite, and they're open. You'd understand them in open theistic terms. And I think originally the Israelites were at that stage of development where, okay, we have our God, Yahweh, and he's the creator, but he's not necessarily the kind of creator that classical theism proposes. He's more limited than that. And then over time, as they learned more about God, they learned, oh, he doesn't actually have this limitation. And so they went on a developmental journey where their awareness of God progressed to understand more and more of his perfection. And by the Christian age, that became classical theism. So I think classical theism is correct. And I think there are passages in scripture that point in the direction of classical theism, like, where it says that in the New Testament that there's no shadow of change with God, which strongly implies he's outside of time. Because if he's inside of time and time is the measure of change, or even if time is just correlated with change, then God would change. And if there's no shadow of change with God, and then he's outside of time. And if he can do anything, which Scripture attests, well, then he's omnipotent. And if he knows everything, which Scripture attests, then he's omniscient. And so I think the elements of classical theism can be supported by Scripture, especially later passages in Scripture where the Israelites were at one end of their journey. But if you go earlier than that, there are a lot of passages that are consistent with open theism. because they weren't yet at the stage of development to realize that God didn't have some of the limitations they thought he did. Um, like when God tests Abraham to find out, is he going to follow him or not? I would have no doubt that Abraham went through an experience that could be understood as God tested me. But later, by the New Testament, we're told in James, no, God doesn't test anyone. And the reason why is, well, he knows what you're going to do, so he doesn't literally have a need to test you. But early in Israelite history, I think the author of Genesis may have thought, on the human level, yeah, God was testing Abraham to find out what he was going to do. And so now that doesn't mean that's what God was doing, but that's how it would have been understood in their cultural terms, in their level of theological development at that point. I would say God's doing something else. But they would have perceived it this way. And so the early writers would have talked about it this way, because it's what they assumed to be happening. And assumptions are different than assertions. Assumptions are things that the human author assumes to be true, even though, but God is not signing off on those. What the human author asserts is something that God guarantees to be true, and it can require some skill to tease apart what's the human author's assumptions versus what's the human author's assertions. This is something I go into more detail about on. I've gone into more detail about on other occasions, but that's the general principle. Well, I think there are a lot of passages in Scripture that you can look to and say, "Hey, this looks like open theism." Yeah, because they went through an open theistic stage in their understanding of God, and that gets corrected as they go further in their journey and they learn more about God through what's known as progressive revelation. Like early on, Adam and Eve are hearing God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, like he's some, you know, ancient Near Eastern king walking through his pleasure garden or paradise, as they were called. Well, okay, that's there's more to the situation than what it says. God doesn't even natively have a body, apart, he doesn't have one natively at all, and he doesn't have one apart from the incarnation. He might assume temporary forms in what's known as the theophany, but none of those concepts are mentioned in Genesis. Adam and Eve just hear God walking like this is a totally normal thing. And that reflects an early stage of um, theological development where people might assume, okay, God has a body. And with time, it becomes clear, no, he doesn't actually have a body. Um, so, though we have to look at those early passages in a different way, like maybe that's a symbol, or maybe that's theophany, or something like that. But we can't just assume God has a body up in heaven. I think there are passages that open theists can appeal to, particularly in the Old Testament, but even in the New as well. One also has to take into account the use of non literal language and things like that, and anthropomorphizing language that makes it sound like God is more like a human than he actually is. But I think ultimately, classical theism rather than open theism is successful, and classical rather than open theism is what the church endorses. Let's see. Oh, and Daniel C. also says, do you think scripture contradicts open theism? Yes, I do, in particular passages. Fun stuff that says, will the alleged gateway experience CIA documents be on the show? Also, if the world had infinite instant respawn for everyone, like in some video games, would it still be morally wrong to kill someone, or would it be okay since they always instantaneously come back to life shortly? Okay. Um, by the gateway experience, um, I'm not in. There are several things I can think of that could be referred to in that way connected with the CIA, on and on the show in multiple episodes, if there's if the gateway experience you're referring to, oh, I'm getting a warning saying my connection is unstable. Please wait while we try to recover. So while we try reconnecting. So I'm gonna pause for just a moment. We'll see if it comes back. Okay, I got a message saying my connection was unstable, but it looks like it's back. Can someone confirm that? Yep. Okay, good. So anyway, just to tie up that gateway thing, I'd have to know more about which gateway thing you're talking about, but it might be covered on the show. You also asked about respawn, like in video games, and I would have to know more about how the respawn works. It's kind of like the transporter on Star Trek. If the transporter literally kills you, then you can't use it. But if your consciousness, if it just transforms you so that your consciousness persists throughout the experience, like in some episodes of Star Trek, then it's more arguable that that it would be morally permissible. And so, in the same way, if you're not literally killing somebody fully, but eh, something else is happening, then it would be potentially possible for one to perform actions that in our world would kill someone, but that don't really kill someone in this other world. But I'd have to know more about exactly how this ability would work. So let's scroll back up again. We got a lot of questions here. I've been going for almost 2 hours. By the way, we had a bit of a late start because there was a problem with the initial stream. So I'm going to go a few minutes past the hour, uh, just so I've got at least 2 hours of stuff. And I want to say thank you to Big Stack for serving as moderator. He also moderates for other groups, including for Catholic Answers Live. And so I wanted to thank him. I've been in contact with him and his wife, and I appreciate the work that he's doing here. Um, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure where this was. I'm not sure where the previous point was. So uh, I may abandon the attempt to find it because I've scrolled up quite a ways. Someone asked what I've been smoking lately. Normally, so I smoke different tobaccos. One of them that I smoke that I have here in this jar, I really like these tobacco jars I found. I remembered them actually from childhood, seeing them in like a Hallmark store, and then I went on eBay and found a couple of them. But what I have in this one is a blend that they do for me at Ash and Ember, which is a pipe shop in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. Um, it's called St. Michael's Holiday. It's an upgrade of a German blend called Devil's Holiday. But I'm not a fan of the devil, and so when they made this upgraded version of it, I named it St. Michael's Holiday, and they've since sold it to other people. In fact, anyone who wants can call the shop and order it. A bunch of people have it. It's one of their best selling blends. Right now, I'm also experimenting with some additional blends that are kind of still in the testing stage. I had gotten a blend at another pipe shop that I really liked, but they had run out of it. They weren't able to get it for a while, and so I called Ash and Ember and said, "Well, here's what it was like." And one of the things that Joe Gibbons, the guy who owns the shop, he immediately identified what one of the key ingredients in it was. It's a plant called deer tongue. It is not the same as tobacco, but it was used by Native Americans. Native Americans would use various different tobaccos in smoking mixtures and rituals and things like that. And deer tongue is, I mean, you can look. I've only seen it dried. I'm sure I could look it up and see what it looks like when it's alive, but I've seen it dried, and it has this very interesting taste and aroma. It's kind of earthy, and it's also sweet smelling. And in fact, but in any event, I asked about, would it be possible to get this other blend? Do you have another source of it, since they can't get it from the blender at the moment? And Joe said, well, I can't order from another company. I'd have the same problems they're having, but I can make you something similar to it. And so he's actually been experimenting with some different formulations. This is a formulation called Morag that he's already selling to his customers that incorporate. He said he used to make blends with deer tongue in them like years ago, but he hadn't done it in a while. And so my query led him to say, hey, I should do some more blends with that. So he came up with this blend called Morag, which he's already selling to people at his store. He's also trying to customize blends that are similar based on his knowledge of my tastes and what I like. Like, for example, St. Michael's Holiday has a lot of sweet notes in it, like blackberry and apricot and things like that. Um, but anyway, he's trying some deer tongue blends that he's making based on my taste. So I have a couple of different formulations here, and I'm testing them out and seeing which ones I like, and we may refine them over time. So that's what I've been smoking lately. Okay. Melody says, is it absolutely necessary to receive an annulment in order to convert and be received by the church? I have paperwork to get this done, and I'm very hesitant due to past abuse. Okay. Well, it is not. It's not absolutely necessary to receive an annulment in order to come into the church. Um, if, let's say, someone has a previous marriage, and they want to become a Catholic, well, if that's all there is to the situation, they can become a Catholic. It might be advisable for them to get an annulment in case they want to marry someone else in the future. It could be good to have this cleared up one way or another before you join the church, but it's not required. Um, you can go ahead and join the church, and as long the church will assume that your previous, since it's never looked at your previous marriage, it will assume that your previous marriage is valid and that you're still bound to that previous person. So you wouldn't be able to marry someone else. But if if you want to you're perfectly free to enter the church without getting an annulment on your previous marriage. And heck, they might look at the previous marriage and say, yeah, that looks valid, you're bound to that guy. But that's not going to stop you from coming into the Catholic Church. So you, under no circumstances does is anyone absolutely required to get an annulment in order to enter the Catholic Church. It may be advised or strongly recommended in a particular case, but it's not a requirement. A variation on the situation would be, let's say you have a previous marriage and you have gone on to marry someone else civilly, or your current spouse, even if you've only been married once, your current spouse has been married to someone else in the past. Well, okay, in this situation, marriage, the legal phrase is marriage enjoys the favor of the law. What that means is um, every marriage is assumed to be valid starting with the first until it's proved not to be. And so if you've had I will just keep it simple. If you've had a previous marriage and you're currently married to someone else, well, your first marriage enjoys the favor of the law until it's shown that it is not valid, at which point the presumption of the favor of the law shifts to your current marriage. Well, okay, in this situation, if you're leading a normal married life, but you're still bound in God's eyes to your first spouse, objectively speaking, that would be adultery. That's not to say you mean it as adultery, but from an objective point of view, if you're married to one person and you're living a normal married life with a second person, you're living in a state of objective adultery, and this is something Jesus stresses in 3 of the 4 gospels. So the church has to take it seriously. But if so one option in this situation is to pursue an annulment on the first marriage, and then, if needed, have the new marriage convalidated after the annulment has been obtained. But it's actually not necessary in any strict sense to get the annulment here, because you could live as brother and sister. You could say, okay, well, um, I can't show that I was free to marry my current spouse, and my current spouse and I have decided to live as brother and sister unless and until such time as we find out we are free to be married. And as long as you're both okay with that, and as long as you're living that way, then you're not living in a state of sin. And so you could go ahead and join the Catholic Church without a problem. And then, if at some future point you are able to pursue an annulment and show that you're free to marry this other person, or were free to marry them, then that's even better. But whether or not you've remarried, there are ways that one could enter a church. So no, getting an annulment is not a strict requirement for becoming Catholic. But if you don't get an annulment, there may be other things that need to happen. Like, well, okay, you need to not get remarried while your previous partner's alive, or you need to live as brother and sister if you've already remarried, or you get the annulment. So there are a range of different options here. But it's still possible for anybody to become a Catholic. It's just a question of which paths do you need to follow in order to live in compliance with Christ's law and do that. Pablo Ignacio Sotomota says, "What is the theological problem with impanation? That is, the idea that just as God incarnated in Jesus, he becomes Eucharisty in Mass." Thanks. Okay, so impanation is, now, different people may use the term differently, but based on its etymology, impanation would mean God enters in to the bread. That bread is pan, and in im is an adaptation of the preposition in. So God is present in the bread. That means the bread is still there. And that is inconsistent. This is an exegetical problem. It's not a problem in the theological sense of God couldn't do this. God could do this if he wanted. He's omnipotent, and there's no contradiction in terms involved. So God could become present in the bread and the wine if he chose. That's not the problem. The problem is exegetical. It's not what Jesus says is going to happen. He doesn't say, if he was in the bread and in the wine, he would say something like, "This contains my body and this contains my blood." He doesn't say that. He says, "This is my body and this is my blood." And that is an is of identity. And so it's not an is of existence. If it was, it would be intransitive, and he wouldn't say, "This is my body." This is clearly meant to be an is of identity, not an is of existence, or an is of predication. And so, given the obvious natural usage of the language, it would imply that the bread and wine are no longer present, and that what is present is his body and blood. So that's the basic problem I would have with impanation. Um, you know, it. So that's the basic problem I would have with impanation. Giles Kangaroo says, hypothetically, what would the church's position be on replicants from Blade Runner, or do androids dream of electric sheep? Well, I've seen the movie, although it's been ages and ages. I've also read the book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Um, m- Basically, from my memory, I would say that the church's position on replicants would be that they are non humans, and that they I guess if memory serves, they are biological life forms. Um, and in the society in Blade Runner or Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, people have no problem killing them. They're not accorded human rights in those societies, but I would say, it's been a while, so I'd have to go back and reread the book, um, or rewatch the movie, but they do appear to be biological entities, and they appear to be rational. And so I would be inclined to say you gotta fail safe in this situation. You have to use the precautionary principle and treat them as if they have rights, because if they're not simply machines that are programmed to act as humans. They're not androids. If they were, then you wouldn't need to do the Voight comp test to distinguish them from a human. So I would say that at least at first pass, my answer would be that we must, on the precautionary principle, assume that any rational biological entity has rights, and therefore we would have to treat them as if they have rights until something else is established, either showing that they're not actually rational, or they're not actually biological entities, or they're different from humans in some other way that would deprive them of at least some rights. But otherwise, err on the side of caution and treat them as if they had rights equivalents to a human's, which, in fact, in Blade Runner and in the book, they don't. William Cooley says the Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years. Where did they get enough food for their cattle and wood for the burnt offerings? Well, so there is scrub in the Sinai Peninsula. There are places where you can have your cattle, whether it's cows, sheep, or goats, where you can have your livestock feed. And the Israelites weren't on the move the whole time. They would camp out in certain locations for long periods, and presumably those places were, and there you can find maps of them and stuff, but presumably those places, at least back in the day when the Israelites were there, this would be about 12,000 BC, there would have been food available for the animal. The wood would not be from large scale trees, because they didn't have large scale trees in the Sinai Peninsula at the time, but they did have scrub, and you could use wood not from trees, but basically from bushes, to offer sacrifices. Incidentally, they had the same issue in Egypt, where they came from. Wood in ancient Egypt was very rare. They would actually import it from Lebanon, for where they have the famous cedars of Lebanon. But they did have small bushes, small trees growing along the Nile. They had reeds and things like that. So they had stuff they could burn, and small amounts of wood on their own, but they didn't have like big planks of lumber. They had to import those. And so so this was a common position or common problem, but they burned sacrifices in Egypt too. They just didn't burn wood from big trees. They burned wood from bushes or other things that grew natively in Egypt. Forever Young says, "What do you make of the new info regarding shafts under the pyramids? A Mysterious World episode on it, perhaps." Well, perhaps, but here's what I think. I think it's extremely suspicious and extremely unlikely to be true. The claims, the reports that this is based on are a paper that, as far as I've been able to determine, I don't think it's been through peer review, and it's using a novel application of a new technology that has not been rigorously vetted. Um, I think it's just, I think this is very unlikely. I think this is, a couple of guys' interpretation of fuzzy data that is there, that is using a technique that has not been rigorously developed and makes very implausible claims, because they're claiming that these shafts under the pyramids go down for 2 kilometers. Well, previously, similar applications of this technology they're using could let you view a few meters under the surface, but not 2 kilometers. And so I think all of this is very implausible. If you'd like a decent reaction, and I may cover it in Mysterious World in the future, but I need to see more uh, interaction with the scientific community on this. I need to see, like, what do others people say about these techniques that they use to allegedly derive this information. And from what I've seen from the pictures, it all looks like they're all extremely fuzzy and suspicious. But that I haven't seen the kind of scientific interaction on this question I need yet. But if you're interested in a useful interaction with it that I have seen, go to the YouTube channel Ancient Architects. Ancient Architects is a British YouTuber, and he's a good guy. He used to be an alternative Egyptology guy who thought, like, the traditional story of the pyramids was completely wrong, and there is this ancient civilization, and they're a power plant, and all kinds of stuff, all this stuff. But then he had an open mind, and so he would interact with the arguments of classical Egyptologists, and over time, Ancient Architects got convinced. It's like, okay, the arguments for alternative Egyptology actually do not correspond to the evidence, and the arguments for classical Egyptology actually do. And so he shifted his position over time to where he's basically on the classical side now. And so I was very interested to see, well, how's he going to interact with these claims, which are definitely alternate? And he did a very nice critique of them. So go to ancientyoutube.com, Ancient Architects, and check out Ancient Architects video responded to these claims. Ryan B says, thoughts on the JFK files? Yeah, I look forward to reading them. I've heard some things about what they contain that are broadly consistent with lines of research I have pursued, but I have yet, they suddenly dump 60,000 pages. They're going to dump at least 80 to 90,000 pages. I haven't had a chance to read them all. But I'm waiting to let other people who do JFK research more intensively than I do kind of pre-process them for me. And I will be reporting on that in the future on Mysterious World. Faith from Fact says, I've been disenchanted with penal substitutionary atonement recently. What are the other atonement theories, and what do you think about them? Well, there's a whole bunch of alternate atonement views. And the Catholic Church doesn't have a single one that it has settled on. I agree that penal substitutionary atonement is problematic. For those who may not be aware, the idea is not just that Christ serves as our substitute, that's the substitutionary part in the atonement, but that he's a penal substitute. Penal means punishment. And so the idea is God punishes Jesus in the full proper sense of punishment, not a metaphor, but really punishes him in our place. And that's how we're atoned. That's how atonement is made for us and God, for between us and God. That's a problem because Jesus is wholly innocent. He's in fact infinitely holy. And so you can't literally punish someone in another person's place if that person is innocent. That would be unjust. And so I agree. Penal substitutionary atonement, taken in any kind of literal sense, is would be unjust on God's part, and therefore He didn't do it that way. But there are other possibilities too. Like, someone may not be punished in your place, but they may pay your fine. And so, for example, like if let's say I'm back to when I was a reckless 18-year-old, and let's say I get in a car accident and it's my fault, and I get, I got to go pay a fine in court because of my reckless driving. This didn't actually happen. I did some reckless driving when I was younger, but I didn't have to go pay a fine for it. Um, But let's suppose I've been fined in court, so I have received a punishment from the court. Jimmy Aiken has to pay the money for this fine, but that doesn't mean someone else can't give me the money. My dad could say, "Well, son, learn a lesson from this, and I'll pay your fine." Well, my dad is not being punished there. He's he's providing me with the ability to to be free of the fine. So the fine is getting paid to the court. But it's not in a way that involves my dad himself being punished in my place. I'm the one being punished. He's the one that takes care of that. And so that opens up other versions of atonement theory, like the one that Saint Anselm of Canterbury proposed, which was it was a substitutionary theory and it was a satisfaction theory. In Anselm's view, the um, gravity of an offense, and this was based on medieval legal concepts of the time, but the gravity of an offense was dependent on who the offense was committed against. So if you punched a peasant, it wasn't as bad as if you punched a king. And correspondingly, you'd get one punishment for punching a peasant and another punishment for punching a king. Um, okay, so the idea is God is the ultimate king. He's infinite. And so offenses against God carry an infinite weight. And humans, being finite, cannot carry an infinite weight. So it requires someone else. It either requires us to suffer for eternity, which is infinite, or it requires God Himself to take the initiative to make satisfaction or pay the penalty that we owe the heavenly court in our place. And so Jesus comes down, He dies on the cross, and that pays an infinite price. Um, and that's what makes atonement for us. There are other theories. There is the Christus Victor theory, which is the idea that Christ defeated the powers of darkness on the cross, and so he's the victor. That's the victus in Christus Victor, Christ the victor. There are other theories. There's a medical model of the atonement where Christ provides healing for us, and none of these have to be exclusive. I've got books on atonement theory where the author says, yeah, these are all capturing different aspects of the atonement. Um, I don't even have a problem with penal substitution as long as you understand it in a non-literal sense, so that the punishment is not literal but is figurative. I think that there is, though, a primary um, expression of atonement theory in the New Testament itself, and that is the sacrifice theory. This you find this, for example, where like in First Corinthians, Paul says Christ is our Passover, meaning He's our Passover lamb. You find it where John the Baptist in John's Gospel says, "Behold, the Lamb of God." He's being presented as a sacrifice in our place. What a sacrifice is a gift. If you give someone something, you sacrifice it to that person so they have the use of it. Now you don't have it anymore. If I give someone a book, well, I've sacrificed that book. I don't have it anymore. I've made a sacrifice, but now they have the book. It's their book and they can do what they want with it. Well, ancient people had an agrarian economy, and so their wealth was not found in books and stocks and things like that. It was in the animals they had and the vegetables they had. And so that's what they would sacrifice to God, because humans among themselves foster good relations by giving each other gifts, by giving each other stuff. You see this when dignitaries meet, like if the president goes to meet the pope, or the president goes to meet a king or something like that, they're going to exchange gifts. And these are little tokens that don't necessarily have much monetary value. I mean, they may from your or my perspective, but not from the perspective of a king or a president. But they give each other gifts as a sign of goodwill and to foster good relations. And this has been the way it was all the way down through history. So, in the ancient world, in the Roman patronage system, for example, You would go to your patron, and even if you're a little, little person in very humble circumstances, you'd bring a little humble gift and you'd give it to your patron in to foster good relations with your patron in hopes that your patron would do something to help you. And so this is a normal way that humans interact. They give gifts or they sacrifice things to give as gifts in order to foster good relations. And so it was natural for people in the ancient world to do that with their deities. Whatever they believed about the deities, you want good relations with them. And so you offer them sacrifices. And so the way the New Testament presents it, Jesus is being offered as our sacrifice, as our equivalent of the Passover lamb, so that or as a sin offering, so that God's wrath may pass over us. And I think that's the primary um, theory of sacrifice in the New Testament. It doesn't exclude all these other theories, but I think that's the primary one, that Christ offers himself as a sacrifice of love on the cross, um, that satisfies or does enough. That's what satisfaction means, doing enough. That does enough as an act of love to compensate God for the offenses of our sins and thus makes atonement for us with God. So that's a brief treatment of that subject. We've gone about 2 hours now. I'm going to do one more question. So let me look down. Ryan B says, are you aware of any people being murdered by demons? How about in parapsychology? Any cases of ghosts causing harm to people? Well, um, there, I'm not aware of anyone who's been murdered by a demon. Um, I am aware, based on New Testament passages, that indicate demons can do severe harm to people and can try to murder people. In fact, in one of the accounts of the epileptic boy, his father says the demons often tried to destroy him and has like caused him to have epilepsy and fall into the fire or fall into water while he's having an epileptic spasm. So I would be very unsurprised, even though I don't know of any cases where someone has been murdered by a demon. I would be very unsurprised to find out there are. I would estimate that's probably happened in human history. When it comes to ghosts harming people, um, th- there are certainly encounters where people perceive that a ghost is trying to harm them. Um, but there are things to be careful about in analyzing those situations. The first one is people tend to freak out when any kind of a spirit shows up, whether it's a ghost or an angel. That's why angels often have to tell people, fear not, don't worry about the fact I'm here. You don't need to freak out. Well, that happens with human ghosts too. Anytime a spirit shows up, people often freak out. And so and when they freak out, they can assume hostile intent when there is none. And so people may perceive a ghost as trying to harm them when the ghost is just trying to say hello. Also, there are situations where the person believes there is a ghost trying to harm them, and there actually isn't one. And this often happens in poltergeist cases where stuff's moving around and so forth, and people think, "Oh, a spirit is trying to harm me." But it turns out that in a lot of cases, not all of them, but in a lot of cases, the evidence actually supports an alternative hypothesis of what's going on in these situations, that it's not actually a spirit that's causing this. Instead, it's a phenomenon known as recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. So it's psychokinesis because stuff's moving around. It's recurrent or it's spontaneous because no one is trying to make it move around. It's just happening. And it's recurrent because it keeps happening. So that's recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK. Well, the RSPK is being produced not by a spirit, but by a living person. This is an example of what's known as live-in agent psi. A living person is doing this, but they're not trying to do it. It's happening spontaneously. And based on a variety of cases that were studied in the 20th century, it became apparent that actually RSPK, rather than a spirit, is responsible for a lot of poltergeist cases. What appears to happen is if a person is under a great deal of stress and they don't feel like they can vent that stress any other way, their subconscious may throw a temper tantrum psychokinetically and start moving stuff around. And for these people, the solution is not have an exorcism, or which would be what you do if it's a demon, or like pray for a soul in purgatory that's haunting this person. The solution is get them stress management therapy. Help them learn how to relax. They can take a meditation class, they can take a stress management class, they can take up a martial art so they can vent their frustration some other way. But since it's being caused by a living person who's under stress, finding a way to address the stress that they're under is actually the cure in this situation. But when a person is first having psychokinetic things happening around them, unpredictably, they may assume a spirit is trying to harm me when in fact it's not a spirit at all. It's their own frustrated subconscious. Um, but I am aware of situations where spirits have tried to harm people, or at least appear to have tried to harm people. And an example of that, I'll actually get you the episode number because I can pull it up right quick. Um, it's episode 164 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So it's at mysterious.fm/164. FM is in FM radio, mysterious.fm/164. In this episode, we tell the story of the Border Patrol ghost, who was a member of the Border Patrol at San Diego in Southern California, who was killed apparently by falling to his death. But he was killed apparently by a smuggler and drug runner. And his ghost then would show up and be looking for the man who killed him. And apparently, he eventually found the man who killed him, who then fell to his death. Now, we don't know from the reports of the situation whether he was pushed by the ghost or just frightened by the ghost and then fell to his death. But one way or another, the ghost was seeking some kind of justice in this situation. And so, there can be situations where a ghost is looking for justice, and that may result in some form of harm to a person. But this is a rare circumstance. This normally does not happen. Ghosts are not normally people who are trying to cause others harm. Normally, they are either just brief after death communications to let people know I'm okay, or they're there to because they're experiencing purgation in some form, and so they may need prayer or things like that. Thomas Aquinas does envision the possibility of a damned spirit appearing to the living by God's permission, but whether that damned spirit, I would suppose such a damned spirit could try to harm the living, just like demons do, because a damned soul and a demon are basically both playing for team evil at this point. So I would imagine they'd be interested in hurting living humans, but appearances of damned souls are very rare. It's normally heavenly souls who are just here to say I'm okay, or it's purgatorial souls that need prayers but aren't out to hurt anybody. So with that all said, we've now been going for more than 2 hours, and I want to thank you very much for stopping by the show today. I'll be doing more of these live streams in the future, and hopefully we will not have the kind of technical issues the last two have had, but I'll investigate those and see what I can find out. Till I see you next time, stay safe, stay well, and God bless you.